So, to review, the first of these 3 points is that emotion powers cognition. From that seems to come a very obvious question. So what? Where can we use emotions? How could this possibly be useful for us in school? And it's here that IE has its its first brilliant point. Everything is interesting, which is to say that everything contains within it the seeds of emotional engagement. We can use emotion everywhere because we can find emotion everywhere. So that sounds extreme, doesn't it? It sounds romantic, it sounds sort of idiosyncratic. Our experience in schools teaches us perhaps that things are actually quite dull. So don't have time in this PowerPoint presentation, or at least I don't want to take the time to go through absolutely everything in the universe and show how interesting it is. Malcolm Gladwell might be up for that challenge if you're ever interested in emailing him. But I can give one theoretical reason for this. We can believe that everything, at least in the K through 12 curriculum, is interesting because everything in the K through 12 curriculum comes from the mind of someone else. We don't just have our fourth graders learn totally new things that no one has ever learned before. At least we don't have them do that for the majority of their education. You might think that's a terrible idea that we do that, and we can actually talk about that later. But most of what they learn is recapitulation. Virtually everything in the K through 12 curriculum is relearning after somebody else. So IE suggests that one way, if you think that something is very boring, that you might be able to become convinced that that's interesting is to look where that information, where that knowledge first came from. So we can learn that chemistry is interesting by looking at the life of Mendeleev, who made his breakthrough by putting together the random minutiae that other chemists have been figuring out into his beautiful periodic table. We might be able to figure out that algebra is interesting by looking at Al-Khwarizmi and how he made this giant mathematical algorithm system for solving absolutely any mathematical puzzle using just a few letters. We might see that geometry is interesting because of Hypatia of Alexander, who... Actually, that picture might be too interesting for some of our students. We might see that geometry is interesting by looking at Hypatia of Alexander, who studied geometry because she thought that it got at these basic forms, these basic ideas, these shapes, which were equal to the divine. They were themselves fundamental reality. She was burned to death, incidentally, by a Christian mob, and her death has been sometimes called the end of the classical period. Okay, so everything in the K-12 curriculum is recapitulation. All of this has been interesting before. All of this can be interesting again. That's a theoretical reason. I can also give you a practical example of this if you're interested. Have you ever thought about where the letter A comes from? You might know that it comes from the Greek letter alpha, and you might know that the Greeks got their letter alpha, and their other letters, from another group of people, the ancient Phoenicians, who wrote their letter aleph like that. And that's, for a long time, as far back as anyone has been able to trace it. And yet, a few decades ago, someone uncovered some inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula between Israel and Egypt, with this picture on them, which, okay, looks like the aleph, but rotated 90 degrees again. And then, still scratching our heads here, and then they found the same inscription, but a bit less stylized. And they realized that the Phoenician word aleph is the same as the Hebrew word aleph, which means ox. Our letter A comes from a pictograph meaning ox, which means that every time in your life that you've seen the letter A, you've had staring back at you, upside down, a decapitated ox head who is ticked off at you for being upside down. The letter A is wonderful. It's full of depth and mystery and long history and sort of goriness. The letter A turns out to be kind of fascinating. So does everything else. All right, so IE says that everything is interesting. Now, there are a few important ways that this can be misunderstood, and I want to run through those. The first way might be that when we say everything is interesting, we mean that we should let kids learn about whatever they want to learn. Give kids free rein in their own learning. Well, you know, I actually kind of think that we sort of should do this, and probably you do too. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. A lot of people in IE, I think, really do believe this. That's not what IE means when it says that everything is interesting. IE is crucially not passion focused in the sense that it's not idiosyncratic a student's individual passion focused. It's not follow your bliss. It's actually saying something much more radical than that and much more helpful. I know people who work at totally child-centered schools where the kids are allowed to study whatever it is that they want, to do whatever it is they want. And my friends have told me that those students disproportionately choose to learn about video games. Now, that's not horrifying, but there's something a little bit sad about that. They choose to study video games because they already know a lot about video games. Maybe the tragedy that comes from this is that these are relatively bored, upper middle class students that my friends work with. They're not moving beyond themselves. Kieran Egan writes, the more you know about something, the more interesting it becomes. I.e., in saying that everything is interesting, gives us a way to lead students beyond themselves. Now, the second misunderstanding that we might get from this idea that IE says that everything is interesting is that IE is telling teachers to make it interesting. Oh, excuse me, I totally forgot about this point. Well, second idea might be that misunderstanding might be that IE is saying we should use curiosity. Well, frankly, yes, we absolutely should use curiosity. Curiosity is powerful and it works toward everything. Curiosity is the love of what is not known. I want to be very careful about how I say this. I would say that IE is not curiosity driven. It drives curiosity. It helps to increase curiosity. Rather, IE is something, again, significantly more powerful. IE recognizes, IE is not just curiosity driven. IE recognizes that love is bigger than curiosity because curiosity is one type of love. IE says that what we should do is help students fall a little bit in love with everything that we can. And that all of those loves, those things that they already know about now, working in tandem, will help propel them into loving things that they don't know anything about yet. That love is bigger than curiosity, and if I can interpret that little sign in a different way, love leads us to more curiosity, toward the love of things that we don't yet know about. Now, the third possible misunderstanding of what IE means when it says that everything is interesting is that what it is saying is that teachers need to make the topic interesting. Okay, again, a very subtle point right here, and I probably, frankly, will be misunderstood, which probably means that this slide was a foolish thing to include in the first place, but let's try it. IE is not saying that teachers make the subject come alive. A few years ago, I gave a chapter of a Kieran Egan book to one of the graduate school classes that I was a part of at the time. And people read it and they said, oh, I understand this. This is like Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, right? He stands in the desk and he says, blah, 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 and he takes his emotion, he moves it to them. No, at least not in this sort of subtly but important way. In IE, the idea is not that we bring life to the subject, but rather the subject is already living. The subject makes us come alive. I want to give a quote from Kieran Egan again. When I read this quote, it was the moment that I first felt that I understood IE and fell in love with it. Everything in the world is wonderful, but students are designed almost to disguise this slightly shameful fact. We represent the world to children as mostly known and rather dull. The opposite is the case. We are surrounded by mystery, and what we know is fascinating. Incidentally, this is not in the book, The Future of Education, but it was around some of the an interview. It was from an interview that he gave in talking about the future of education. If you're looking for a really good Egan book to get into to really understand IE, I'd actually recommend this book probably above all of the other ones. All right, this idea that everything is interesting is not orthodox opinion in educational theory. In fact, it's quite unorthodox. It's heretical. I think it's revolutionary. So how can we summarize this? Maybe we could say that everything that students learn can be thought of as a thickly crusted loaf of bread. Now, if you had a loaf of bread, but you'd never seen one or tasted one before, if you came from a culture that used some other form of grain, for example, you might see this and not recognize that it's food. You might sort of tap it. That was me tapping my MacBook. I don't know if that got picked up by the microphone or not. You might tap it, and it might sound sort of hollow and hard, and it doesn't sound like food. And you could lick it, and it would taste sort of bitter and maybe chalky flour, and it wouldn't really taste like food. All topics, most topics, maybe not video games, have crust. They are hard to get into from the outside of them, at least at first. And i.e., the teacher's task is to help get the kids into the loaf, through the crust. Now, to do that, the teacher has to first learn quite a bit about the subject and fall a little bit in love with it and recognize what is the most amazing thing about it that they really want to bring out and share that love with the kids. And then they need to take the kids in. So the teachers need to be natural learners. But then they need to do the spelunking expedition of taking the kids into it. So the question that comes next is, how do we do that? How do you bring students into these topics? How do you bring them through the crust?